Hi, everybody. I'm David Wheeler with Conserve Wildlife Foundation of New Jersey, and we're here today to talk about the black bears of New Jersey. And to start our presentation, I'm going to do a short reading from my book, Wild New Jersey, and this is actually the very start of the book. My dad and I walked up the mountain trail on a chilly autumn morning. Laurel and wild cherry and rhododendron cloaked the narrow boulder-strewn path, limiting our visibility to just a few yards ahead. We were the first hikers out that morning, but we were not alone. That was apparent right away. Fresh claw marks scarred the fallen tree trunks lining the trail. The parallel incisions on the logs left wood shavings in the dirt. Patties of bear scat greeted us every few minutes, the high bush blueberries still apparent in the droppings. With each bend in the trail, our anticipation grew. Will this be the day? Will we finally encounter a black bear in the wild? Step after step, my eyes focused on the trail. A sudden grip on my shoulder brought me to a halt. My dad stared ahead, eyes alight. No more than 30 yards before me, an adult black bear and cub foraged along the edge of the trail, noses to the ground. They were oblivious to us. We stood in amazement as another cub came into view from the gently wooded slope arching up to the right. The bear family foraged for insects and grubs, drifting in and out of our lines of vision. The wind must have shifted, for suddenly the cubs looked up alertly. With no signal recognizable to us, they trotted downslope away from the trail. Where exactly is Mama Bear? We silently went through our mental checklists of what to do in case of a bear encounter, realizing at the worst possible moment, as we later shared, just how much of our assumed knowledge was contradictory. Shout loudly or remain quiet. Stand aggressively or withdraw meekly. Avoid eye contact or give it a friendly wink. The answer appeared in the form of the heaving black shoulders of Mama Bear, who lumbered across the trail towards her family. Unlike the others, she was in no hurry. This was her forest. We were only visiting. During those moments of watching the family of bears, I felt that I could have been in any great American wilderness, and I was. I was in New Jersey. And with that gives you a glimpse into uh, one person's encounter with black bears in the wild. And this had been many years ago, at a time when it was not as common to see black bears in the wild as it is now in certain parts of the state. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. We're going to talk about the black bears comeback in New Jersey. Of course, we'll touch upon the controversy as we seem to mainly encounter black bears in the media or online, is often as told through the controversy of the bear hunt or not in New Jersey. We're going to touch upon that, but we're really going to look mostly at the animal itself and its incredible adaptations and behavior and existence today in our wild in New Jersey. So just a brief word about Conserve Wildlife Foundation. We work to protect rare wildlife all around the state of New Jersey and beyond. We're a nonprofit organization, and our work is predicated on field science. In other words, doing things like surveys and monitoring and wildlife bandings out in the field. And we support that with an abundance of education work, environmental education in classrooms all across the state, adult programs, as well as programs for children. And of course, a big part of what we do is dependent not only on our biologists, but on our volunteers as well. And I'll give you the website at the end of the presentation to learn more. So we're going to start with a quick look at the relationship between man and black bear in particular here in North America. Interesting, many Native American tribes had a great reverence for bears in general, but it seemed to be a bit of a split between the way they looked at our two main bear species, at least in the region that became the continental United States, the black bear and the grizzly bear. They both were looked at as creations of the Great Spirit by many tribes. The black bear, however, was looked at more in a positive way that way, whereas the grizzly was often referred to as a creation of the evil spirit, in light, no doubt, of their much greater aggression and capacity to injure or kill people, both then and now in the wild, relatively speaking, in relation to the black bear. Nonetheless, bears were renowned mostly for their perceived powers of. They were often connected with medicine and healing. They were looked at as having great resilience, and it's something that over the centuries has been proven time and again for black bears here in North America. Um, Moving forward from through the founding of the U.S. and the years ensuing, I see a pretty clear-cut dichotomy between the way bears are pictured in pop culture. You have, on one hand, you have the teddy bear, the favorite long time-honored children's play toy that was actually founded, or not founded, but created in honor of Teddy Roosevelt, who, in an incident, refused to shoot a cub that was chained to a tree in what would have been a very disappointing semblance of an actual hunt. Uh, TDR refused to do that, and the media put up headlines about Teddy Bear, and within a day, an intrepid entrepreneur had created teddy bears in his honor, and they, suffice it to say, they caught on quite well. And ever since, we've had, on one hand, quite a bit of this favorable, very cute, endearing connection to bears in our culture. In addition to teddy bear, we've also had Winnie the Pooh, of course, again, also named after a black bear. In that case, it was a black bear from North America brought over to the London Zoo, named Winnipeg, thus becoming Winnie the Pooh. And of course, Smokey the Bear, also based on a black bear and the protector of the forests in throughout the last 50 to 60 years. Of course, that's balanced by the somewhat different portrayals we've seen in many Hollywood blockbusters. In many cases, you can say bears, in this case more so grizzlies than black bears, but it still kind of captures that split. Bears, in this case, being the arch enemies of some of our best and most popular leading men, from Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio to Alec Baldwin and Mr. Hopkins himself, Anthony Hopkins. So we have that split kind of in our cultural mindset about bears here in North America, both a love and a very healthy fear. And just to put it into perspective, the difference is not minor between black bears and grizzlies. And grizzlies you only have in the far northern western regions of the continent, primarily in Canada, but also going down to Yellowstone and the northern Rockies. Black bears, however, are spread much more around the state. You can see from the map here, the black bear, which is their range is in dark gray, is pretty abundant throughout the country, whereas grizzlies are much more, in that holdout of the Northwest. Polar bears, of course, are limited to solely around the Arctic, which is a whole separate conundrum that they're facing right now. But you can see in the sizes difference between grizzlies and black bears. It's really like two totally different animals, and we'll see that as we talk about their behavior relative to people. Their size reflects not only the way they interact with people, but also even the way they interact with their environment in many ways. The grizzly being the true largest predator in the modern era in North America, along with the polar bear, of course, and then the black bear being sort of an animal that's been thrust into that role, but didn't naturally grow with that as its mindset. So we're going to look at a few pretty indicative headlines of how we often will encounter black bears now, at least through the media and through social media. One of them, of course, is the fun-loving way of look at what the bears are up to now as they're going through their wanderings, often in summer as they prepare for fall and thus hibernation after that. Bears using swimming pools all throughout the state, at different locations throughout the state, often making for fun, endearing headlines and pictures because the people aren't nearby. One of the most bizarre and yet true and documented individual bears is a bear that was nicknamed Pedals, as in pedaling a bike, by the media, for its habit of walking on its hind legs, which is truly rare. It's not something we ever see other than maybe in those old-fashioned circuses. It's absolutely not something that is common or expected, but nonetheless, this bear had an injury and adapted to one of its paws and adapted by learning how to walk on two legs quite well, and was spotted for over 3 years. They believe it was killed in 2016. And that was all throughout Morris County at different spots. Um, Unfortunately, many of the other kind of headlines are a different kind of feeling we get, and that's bear encounters that involve people in a negative way. And most bear encounters in the wild, if it's too close or if there's any kind of habituation, we're going to talk about this later, that can usually only go negative. The most recent one in West Milford, you had a black bear entered a person's garage. A man had been out walking his dog. The garage door was open. The bear went in, and when the man returned, the bear, I think, swiped at him, injured him. It was and ultimately, the bear had gone into his garage looking for food. The authorities were able to find the bear and did have to put him down. Anytime a bear is involved in a human encounter to that degree, for safety reasons, the bear has to be put down. And so it's an encounter we want to do everything we can. I'm going to talk later about how we can make sure we avoid anything that would help trigger those kind of encounters unnecessarily. But that's the other kind of headlines that we'll see the bears involved in, particularly in this time of year. And of course, the biggest one over New Jersey and over the past decade has been the bear hunt, which has been on again, off again. There's a very vocal crowd against bear hunting in New Jersey and a very vocal crowd for it. And there's true emotion on both sides. And we'll talk about some of the background for that later as well. But let's start out, at least as we explore the black bear today, let's start out by taking a look at the bear itself, separate from humans to some degree, to whatever degree that's possible nowadays. But looking at, first off, its appearance, you saw compared to the grizzly, it's a much smaller animal, but that doesn't make it smaller compared to us. Males average 400 pounds a bear. You get them up to 600. We've had bears found 700 and above even as well, 700 pounds and above. Female is significantly smaller, roughly about half the size, about 175 pounds on average, and the larger females can go up to 400. So these are big animals. They're by far the biggest animal we have, biggest wild animal we have in New Jersey, certainly as a predator or carnivore or omnivore technically. And so they are the king of the forest here in New Jersey. They can live a long life in the wild, an average of 18 to 25 years. Once they get past that first year, which is always the biggest challenge, as with many wildlife, many mammal species in particular, they can live a long and healthy life. Their senses are extraordinary. And in almost every way, they go far past people in terms of their senses and their senses and their athletic skills too. So these are animals that can run 25 miles an hour, up to 30, 35 even, very fast, incredibly agile for an animal their size. They're great at tree climbing. A big function of that is their claws are about 2 inches long, and they're curved. They're ideal for climbing trees. So you have this incredible creature that can run fast, that can climb trees, and to top it off, they can swim. These are decathlon type animals, superhero kind of animals in many ways. They can swim incredibly well also. So there's not really much they can't do in the wild. We're fortunate that their nature is such that they're not extremely aggressive the way grizzly bears are. By and large, they're very docile relative to grizzlies. And we're fortunate in that way. But I mentioned their senses. In addition to their athletic skills, they can see very well. They are nearsighted. So things that are far away, often when they stand on their hind legs, they're trying to get a better sight. But near anything close by, they can see very well. Their hearing is also stronger than people's hearing. They hear very well. Their ears are, you can even see from the picture there, their ears are large and shaped in a way that allows them to maximize what they're able to hear. But it's their nose that separates them from anything else. So we, as people, many of us have dogs, and I know I'm always amazed when my dogs are able to smell things that you can just see with every step on walking your dog or playing outside. Their nose is going a mile a minute in every single direction. Dogs can smell around 7 times stronger than people. They have that strong of a an olfactory system. Their scent ability to smell things from so far away and react to them far before we do, and we wonder how they know that. Well, bears can smell things up to around 100 times stronger than people. So picture that. Picture your dog, which has an incredible ability to smell things, and then now you picture a bear, and it goes far beyond that. And so bears can we've seen cases where bears can smell something in the wild up to 2 miles away, a food source up to 2 miles away. So it's really an incredible benefit to the bear to have this. Certainly, in terms of anything from looking for prey to cases where it feels in jeopardy or where it's trying to protect its cubs. This is a tremendous asset to have that kind of power in their nose. And of course, what another thing we've long associated with bears is their ability to hibernate. That every winter they hibernate. Now, technically, they're not true hibernators, at least not in the scientific term. Animals like chipmunks or woodchucks truly hibernate, where their body is completely more or less shut down, as we picture it. Bears are, it's really more of a winter dormancy. From our perspective, non-scientifically speaking, it still is the same function as hibernation in many ways. They really do shut down their body to a great degree. One of the big differences, however, is on those milder winter days that we've been getting more of in recent years. They do have the ability, let's say we get a nice warm stretch in January, they do have the ability to come out of that hibernation for a few days, and as needed with the weather warming, if they want to search for food, they have the ability to come out of that in a much simpler way than, for instance, the true hibernators. So that's one of the big differences there. But nonetheless, the physiological changes they go through are pretty dramatic. You have their heart rate and their metabolic rates drop 75 to 80%. They gain up to 30 pounds of fat right before they go into hibernation. And basically, more or less, everything comes to a not necessarily a halt, but a tremendously dormant version of the hibernation that you picture. That timing is typically around as early as October, November. If it looks like it might be a colder winter, the mama bear and her cubs will go to hibernate. The male will often hold out a bit longer. It has less concern about protecting the cubs and keeping the cubs safe through the winter, obviously, than the mom bear would with the cubs. So the male bears tend to hold out till December in a typical year. Although, granted, all of that is dependent on weather, which has been in more flux than ever. In terms of locations, bears will typically look for anything that's not too big. They're not looking for something big because they want to really conserve that body heat. And so they'll look for anything from a kind of a dugout excavated area. Could be under a root mass. It could be in a cave. It could be even under a building. Basically any area where they feel that a sense of safety, but also the ability to conserve their body heat to the greatest degree possible, they can use that. So they're, very flexible in that way. And bears, I mentioned about the mama bear with her cubs. Well, a big part of the cubs for the sow, for the mother bear, they usually reach about 3 to 5 years old before they can have their first litter of cubs. There have been cases where as young as 2, they're able to have cubs, and as old as 20. So it's a long period where they potentially are fertile, but it's really usually the 3 to 5 is when they start that process. Um, I mentioned with the hibernation that usually will go through or will start in November, December. But for it's interesting for the mother bear. So the mother bear usually will mate in summer, and then through a delayed pregnancy, um, that usually waits until the hibernation period to start going through that cycle, and then to give birth in January. And so you have this timing that very much, in a sense, takes into account that the hibernation period as well. And so typically, once the cubs are born in January, it's usually an average of around 3 cubs. It could be as few as 1, as many as 5. Average of 3. And New Jersey is one of the more fertile areas in the country for black bears. A testament to, which I'll talk about later, a testament to our strong habitat and kind of general friendliness of the area in terms of black bears being able to live and find prey and reproduce. An average of 3 typically, and they're born blind, and for the first month or so they're completely blind, and it's only after around a month that these tiny little bear cubs are able to see, and at around the same time they start walking as well. But their period with dependent on the mother bear is a full year and a half. So these truly do go through a childhood dependency on the mom for their survival. They're very vulnerable during that time, and so they go about a year and a half with the mom, depending on her, to catch all the food initially, and then over time to start to train them to do likewise. And really, if they can survive that first year, roughly 70% are able to here in New Jersey. In other parts of the country, it's not so much. Some of the threats from other predators in other parts of the country, like grizzlies or mountain lions, um, are much, and even some of the other animals that you wouldn't expect. When the cub is that young, they're incredibly vulnerable, and so technically would be at risk. But as they do get a little bigger, they're able to uh, survive here in New Jersey most of the wildlife threats that they might face once they start to get a little older. So getting through that first year is key. Once they do that, then they're in much better likelihood of living a couple decades later. And black bears, I haven't talked yet about where they live in New Jersey. And so they are found in all 21 counties. However, the largest population by far is in the northwest part of the state, the part of the state that's most wild and more so rugged and remote habitat than much of New Jersey. Black bears really like dense habitat. We're talking about things like um, mixed upland forest. We're talking about dense swamps, forested wetlands, and then they also like areas where they still have access to things like meadows and fields and riparian areas. So they like that mix, but they really do depend on most bears depend on black bears depend on denser kind of habitat, and that is interesting because grizzlies in the West are able to live in much more open kinds of habitat. And one of the theories is that black bears adapted, they evolved not as the very highest level of the food chain. And so they weren't as comfortable out in the open as the grizzly was, which wasn't worried about anything hurting it back then. So the black bear became much more acclimated to living in the denser forested areas. And so that is where we see the bulk of them today. However, like I said, they are found all throughout the state. In terms of prey, they're very flexible in terms of what they can eat. They surprisingly, I know for me, when I learned this years ago, and many people are surprised to realize that 3/4 or more of what they eat is plants. Um, as much as kind of, I think many people grow up thinking that black bear is a carnivore, it eats just meat, but in reality, it's much more dependent on plants throughout the year. Um, when they emerge from hibernation, they're really looking to gain energy fast. And some of the best ways that they will find this is things like, first off, they'll look for things like a carrion, roadkill, maybe deer roadkill, or some other animal that's already dead. There's no work involved, and they can start to regain their energy that way. They also look for things like skunk cabbage and all the vegetation that's emerging at that around that exact same time that the bears are emerging from their hibernation. So they're gathering energy early on with a lot of vegetation as well, along with skunk cabbage. They're also then they start to shift as the summer comes on. They start to look for berries. Once the berries are in bloom, they feast on blueberries and blackberries. Um, these are a huge source for black bears. Uh, and then as fall comes on, they start to look for harder mast items, things like acorns and nuts. So all of these are great sources of energy, and for bears as they get into fall, they are feasting. They and of course mixed throughout this is they're opportunistic. So when they can catch fish, they'll catch fish. When they can um, catch even young deer that they will kill on occasion. They're typically not hunting full-grown healthy deer, but they will kill younger deer, smaller mammals. Um, but again, that's more supplemental. But come fall, they're going all out. They're just eating constantly. They can eat up to 20,000 calories a day, which is the equivalent of around 100 shorty subs at a place like Wawa. So 100 of those a day. Um, it's quite a bit of food. So you can see they're really stocking up their energy as they as they prepare for hibernation, because they really have to be fully prepared for them to make that as efficient as possible. So black bears. So we know a little bit more about the bears themselves. Well, let's talk about how we've interacted here in our history, both in the U.S. and New Jersey, with the black bears. And so early on, uh, black bears during the colonial days, black bears were a fixture in a very diverse ecosystem here in the Northeast, where you had mountain lions, you had wolves, you had elk, you even had bison as far east as Pennsylvania. Um, it was a much more thorough and kind of diverse ecosystem as you got towards the larger kind of mammals at the time. But they were hunted out. Mountain lions and wolves were hunted out. Black bears were hunted tremendously as well. They were never wiped out fully from the east the way the mountain lion and the gray wolf were, but their numbers dropped precipitously. So you're looking at back in the early 1800s when their numbers really started to decline. There would be cases where you'd have tens of thousands of pelts, bear pelts, either trapped or hunted each year, and so you started to see the numbers decline. And here in New Jersey, their numbers, anywhere, they were basically looked at as anywhere across the Northeast. They were looked at as competition. They were um, hunted less as direct threats and more as competitive threats. So they were looked at as competitors for our crops, for our livestock. They would, and they still will. At times, they'll raid crops or livestock if the timing is right, and if kind of all else being equal, if they have the opportunity, they are known to do that. And so that would be a major impetus for their hunt back in the day and through the 1800s. Come the 1900s, their numbers had really declined pretty dramatically. New Jersey, as we got into the mid 1900s, they really were becoming hard to find at all. By the late 80s, late 70s, and early 80s, you were hard pressed to find even 100 of them in the late 70s. I think there was around 100 sightings at the time in a given year, dramatically down from their peak, a couple hundred years earlier. By 1981, is when it had dropped the most. There was a total of 10 sightings of black bears in the whole state. And this is an animal that, had been widespread enough that they had, were a fixture of the environment. And even through the 1950s, they were everyone knew they were in a decline. And so one of the things that was sought to stem that was to make them a game species. And so the mid 50s, they were named as a game species here in New Jersey. And the goal was to stop the indiscriminate killing of black bears. And uh, while that helped, it was so late in their decline that it wasn't able to turn the tide completely. And so they did continue to decline. Like I said, their low was probably 1981 ish, give or take a few years, and only then did they start to bounce back. And one of the things, there's a couple of reasons that helped them to come back. One of the things is that we saw over the after our land had been so cleared through the 1800s and early 1900s, cleared for everything from farms, especially back then, but then as time went on, cleared for towns and suburbs and development. Through the later 1900s, you started to see a lot of this land return. To a lot of old farms had fallen back into becoming forests and then growing into mature forests. And by the second half of the 1900s, you had this return of mature forests across large areas of the state. You had a lot of protected areas. A lot of roughly 1/3 of the state is protected, which is huge. No other state has that kind of protected area in the northeast or in the East Coast. It's surprising because we're the most densely populated state, and yet we have more land protected in our state, percentage-wise, more land protected in our state than anywhere else on the East Coast, and that's in large part due to sportsmen and hunters have been a huge proponent of that, as have nature aficionados and also strong leadership at the top in New Jersey for many decades on the environmental front. New Jersey, while we've always faced an inordinate amount of environmental threats, uh, it's also put us on the front end of trying to think ahead as much as possible because we've been forced to. But it doesn't diminish the fact that we've had good governance on many of those areas and kind of looking ahead and for many decades on in terms of trying to protect our natural resources. And so nonetheless, you had a mature forest coming back. You had the bear's status as a game species, so it couldn't just be, indiscriminately killed. And then you also had healthier ecosystems returning, where you did have more of a balance because the ecosystems were just becoming more stronger and more mature. You also had our waters improving. You had from our lows in the mid to later 1900s, the water has been recovering tremendously since the Clean Water Act and the Environmental Protection Act. All of this has helped our environment return, and of course that helps bears because they are so dependent on much of that. So we started to see bears returning, and I should also mention we also saw bears returning to New Jersey from both New York and Pennsylvania, and this also helped their numbers increase here in New Jersey. And once they started increasing, they increased dramatically, as you can see here. So 1995, they really were only left in the northwest, most remote parts of the state. Um, by around 2000, within that 5 years, you saw roughly a doubling of the territories where and the townships and municipalities where you had black bear sightings. Within the next 8 years, you saw it continue to grow. By 2014, it had covered much of the state, and now by 2020, black bears have been spotted in every single one of our 21 counties, and in many of the towns. The majority of our towns have had black bear sightings by far now in all parts of the state, from Cape May all the way up to Sussex. And so it's been a true expansion. To be clear, however, it's somewhat misleading to say they're just found statewide. In many of the cases, the further you get from the northwest part of the state, the more likely that those bear sightings are roaming individual bears as opposed to a bear setting up shop there. So there's still, especially when you think about denning bears and bear families um, reproducing and being a fixture in an area, that still, by and large, is much more relegated to the northwest part of the state, particularly north of Route 78, west of 287. It still holds by far the most bears of the rest of the state. You're more likely, if you have a bear sighting there, it's more likely that's a bear on the move, as opposed to a bear, choosing that site to make it its home. And then this year, we've seen roughly double the amount of sightings and encounters in 2020. Uh, Many people tie it to COVID-19 in many ways because probably a couple of reasons. One, as people have been less in, bears maybe we're venturing into areas that they wouldn't have with more human activity. That's a big cause of that likelihood. Uh, but another factor would simply be that people have also been more, with so many people either working from home or using our once people were allowed to go back to state parks and nature areas, they're out there in the open more. So there's probably a bit of more awareness and the ability to see a bear. If a bear is wandering through somebody's backyard up in Warren County, if that person was at work, um, in physically at work in past years, that person now might have been working in a place where they look out the window and see that bear. So there's another sighting. So it's probably a combination of both. Bears being a little more, uh, going a little further from their usual routine, and at the same time, people being more in a place to observe them. So you've had more sightings, more encounters, and uh, more. Fortunately, we haven't had a lot of more dangerous encounters, but we have had more encounters that are at a point where you have bears, for instance, like the garage incident I mentioned earlier, bears entering places where we certainly would rather than not, and where it could be a safety issue, without a doubt. And so the elephant in the room with any discussion on bears, sooner or later, you talk about the hunt. Um, in New Jersey, like I said, it's always been a hot button issue. You have, um, looking at here's some numbers that went through 2015. You had the hunt canceled in numerous years. Political leadership decisions, whether our governors have often, in many ways, have alternated on whether they're pro hunt or anti hunt. But nonetheless, in the years when they've had the harvest, you're looking at roughly 250 to 650 bears killed in a given year through the hunts. Um, and these hunts are typically what's measures what's on state lands. Um, the current situation is that there's no bear hunts on state lands, although you can still have them on private lands. The nuisance reports have likewise kind of gone through ebbs and flows, as have just sightings overall. Again, 2020 being a spike, at least in the first half of the year, which, like I said, is some relation to COVID. Nonetheless, while the hunt, from my own perspective, our organization doesn't take a position either way. We're not an advocacy group, so to make that clear right up front, so we don't take a position either way. I will say that I know people on both sides of the issues who are very emotionally committed to why there should or shouldn't be a bear hunt in New Jersey. And I will say I understand the logic on both sides. Uh, you know, one thing, there is no doubt that bear numbers have increased to a point where it is a concern in parts of the state. In many parts of the state, it's not, but in the northwest part of the state, you do have bears at a density that you really don't see elsewhere. Along the Appalachian Trail, for instance, which goes from Maine down to Georgia, New Jersey by far has more bears per acre or whatever, per square mile, than any other part of the Appalachian Trail region. And I know one of the goals of the state in terms of regulating, having the hunt help regulate the bear population. Right now, there's areas where you have 2 to 3 bears per square mile in parts of the northwest part of the state, which is very much on the high end. they would like to kind of reverse that and maybe get to one bear every 2 or 3 square miles. And so that's one of the goals with managing the population. Again, people have their own opinions, and that's not our main angle today. But at least wanted to give you some of the background that underlies that discussion. And so a big part of life for black bears, and particularly for male bears, but really for any cubs once they leave. I mentioned that cubs stay with the mom for around 18 months. They're dependent on her, but then come 18 months, give or take, she chases them out because she knows it's her time. She wants to have, she wants, she knows it's basically every 2 years those mother bears will have young, and so she's ready for her next litter. And so she'll chase out the cubs. They'll have to find their own way at that point. They've been taught everything they need to know, and so then they'll go off on on their own. Males in general tend to wander quite a bit more among black bears. You see here an example of just a single bear over the span of around half a year, 6 months, give or take, uh, making its way all the way from the Hudson River in the east to the Delaware River in the west, across very mountainous and rugged terrain, as well as making its way through many suburbs and towns. So that's not easy wanderings, but the black bear is not afraid to move around and cover tremendously large distances. Among mammals, that's a very common thread. We had a bobcat that we tracked at about 100, moving 108 miles from western New Jersey all the way towards Harrisburg, just a single bobcat, and so it's pretty incredible the movements that these large mammals can do in the most densely populated state and region in the whole country. The fact that they're able to do this is extraordinary, but it doesn't change the fact that it's also can be very dangerous. You look at our roadways. So we're the most densely populated state, but we also have more roads than anywhere else, and many of these are very busy roads. And what's interesting, this is bobcat data here, but it reflects bears in many ways as well. Is each of those colored dots is a specific bobcat that was tracked. These are sightings over a course of time and many months typically. And what you find is in most of these situations, these major highways would just be barriers that the bobcat or the bear will come to and basically not be comfortable crossing that. And so as a result, it kind of limits and fragments its habitat. Even if there might be good habitat on the other side too, it can't get over there, or it's so hard to get over there that it rarely can cross between the two. And so you see this all across the state when you think about our major highways in the north part of the state, routes 80 and 78, 287. These are really tough to cross. You think about further south in the state, highways like the Turnpike, the Parkway, the Atlantic City Expressway. All of these are major barriers for wildlife, and it's not just mammals. It's a number of other species as well. Worst case, it causes tremendous amounts of roadkill and can really damage populations, because these are, in many cases, you look at things like salamanders and some of our reptiles, these are very vulnerable to begin with. And then when you're looking at times a year where they're particularly likely to cross roads, they absolutely can critically wound an individual population. And for bears and bobcats as well, it not only separates groups and can, over the long term, for certain wildlife, not so much for black bear, but for other wildlife, it can genetically separate them enough that you don't have interbreeding the way you should, and thus the population becomes much less healthy over time. So one of the things that our group, Conserve Wildlife, is working with the state Endangered and Non-Game Species Program and a number of other groups as well, is looking to connect habitat where possible. And that could be anything from giving underpasses where wildlife can connect. If you think about culverts of water that go under different highways, making those a little bit more wildlife friendly. So maybe having buffers on either side of the culvert where the wildlife can connect between the two sides. So in most cases, it's more of a planning tool and something where possible you want to connect habitat. We do see because of examples like the black bear and bobcat, they utilize whatever they can to connect. So old train lines are a great connector for them. You know, train lines that have now become disused or be kind of naturalized again, or even turned into bike trails. These now are kind of corridors that large mammals like that can use to connect. I know I've seen bears a couple times over the years in places they had no business being. Woodbridge, where I had to look at a Google Maps image later that night when I had seen a bear earlier that day, and then how did it get there? How did it? And then realize that even though it was so much development, that there was either waterways or old train lines gave these tiny narrow corridors that the bear could use to get around. So we want to give them a little bit more naturalized kind of ways to do that and make sure that we don't lose some of our species entirely. And so, what about for you? What about if those anyone watching today is particularly interested in encountering black bears, or maybe you're not interested in not encountering them, you just want to learn about them. Um, let's talk a little bit about some of that. But let's start with a very uh, a strong warning that while these are so far few and far between, black bear attacks are incredibly rare. There's been so few over time. New Jersey never had any um, in its history until 2014, when a 22-year-old hiker was killed in Opshawa Preserve in West Milford. And from all um, everything we could understand about it, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't baiting the bear. He wasn't uh, trying to feed it. It just seemed like one of those flukes. And it's important to remember with a black bear, with any wild animal, these are wild animals. And so, as much as we know how they're likely to act, you know, there are those cases where an animal could be sick, it could be injured, it could just be a reaction that we just don't understand. And in this case, it was a one in a million fluke, but it was tragic, and it resulted in this gentleman losing his life. So I say that not to demonize the bear, or to scare anyone from going out in the wild, but just as a reminder that these are wild animals. And so, as fascinated as any of us are, we always want to keep our distance and do everything we can to ensure our safety and the animal safety. And one of the best ways we can do this is, well, let's start with a no-brainer. Obviously, never feed any wildlife uh, in such a way. I mean, bird feeders are different, but just never do anything like you see in that upper right photo. Um, it's literally caused so many problems, and it's not just for people but for wildlife. Fortunately, society has gotten away from doing that in many cases, but you still see it on occasion. So that's the no-brainer. Don't ever do that. There's never reason to do anything like that. Secondly, though, more common as an issue is people not putting the garbage away. So for anybody who lives in an area that is frequented by bears, but even if you don't, even in Cape May, bears are very few and far between, to put it mildly. But a lot of other wildlife is found in the area. So do your best to make sure your garbage is put in a way that's not reachable. For those who do live in bear country, you want to get special garbage lids that are bear proof. You just don't want to leave any food out. And I mentioned about bird feeders. Of course, we want to always do everything we can to feed birds and enhance our wildlife habitat. However, for those who do live in bear habitat, you also want to make sure you're not attracting bears. And so for people in the Northwest, more remote parts of the state, you want to be careful that your bird feeder doesn't become this attractive nuisance for bears to come there. Same thing with pet food. You just don't want to leave it out to a degree that bears will start frequenting your yard and get used to you as a source of their food. That's when you can create problem bears, habituated bears, that then sooner or later there's going to be some kind of issue or incident, as likely as not. Um, and then in terms of well, what if you do encounter a bear wherever, and that could be anywhere, right? So when you do encounter one, um, Black bears, this is very different from the kind of advice you would give with grizzlies, which are a much more direct and obvious threat. Black bears have adapted in such a way that they still see people as something to be afraid of. And so typically, if you do encounter a bear in the wild, you want to stand tall, you want to be loud, you want to make a lot of noise, you want to scare it away. Um, the whole thing about playing dead and all that you wouldn't do that except with a grizzly bear and somewhere in Wyoming or Manitoba, somewhere in the far west. It's not something you would do with black bears. Black bear, you want to intimidate out of there, and most of the time that'll work. Um, if you are hiking or camping in a place that you do feel like it could be a real risk, obviously you can bring something like pepper spray or mace just to feel an added layer of protection. But otherwise, if you're making noise, more likely the bear is going to hear you and steer clear and get out of there. If you are camping or anything outside, you want to make sure you don't leave your food near in your tent or near your tent, because they, like I said, they can smell food incredibly from far away, and you certainly don't want them, even if they don't have any interest in you, going up to your tent because they smell that food inside. So you just want to keep that separate in whatever way you can. You just don't want to attract them to you, whether it's your house, your tent, your person. You don't want to give them a reason to come anywhere near you, except from a safe distance where you can admire them safely and not disrupt them. One other point with any, and this goes with any kind of wildlife like this, if they're reacting to your presence, that means you're probably too close. So it's just a good rule of thumb. If you do see a bear and you're just admiring them and they're just doing their thing, you're doing yours, keep your distance, use your binoculars, your camera, whatever it is, from a distance. And if they're not reacting to you, then you're probably at a good safe distance. No need to push it and try to get closer and closer for that perfect shot, because they're unpredictable wild animals. You don't want to take any chances. What about if you're in the wild and you don't see one, but you're just curious, you want to see what their tracks look like? You see that on the left of the screen, these are black bear prints. The back foot there is around 5 to 7 inches. That their print. So that's a pretty substantial. You're looking at from here to there, basically. It's a pretty substantial size. Nothing like any of the other ones we would see in our area, mountain lions not being among that. But bobcats, coyotes, or even a domestic dog, you see they're all quite different. The footprint is very different for the black bear. So if you do see that, anything like that in the wild, you know what you're looking at. The biggest difference between bobcat and coyote or dog is the lack of the claw prints, because they have retractable claws. The more likely way you would encounter bears would be not seeing them as much as encountering some of their signs. You see on the bottom right, the black bears like to scratch themselves, both because it feels good, but also to leave their scent, kind of let other bears know they were here. They also scratch trees. As you see in the top right, you see the hair left in the top middle. And of course, bear scat is what you would be most likely to encounter in bear country. You can often tell there's of course no shortage of ways online to differentiate everything. But often if you're seeing berries and seeds mixed into a very large scat, then there's a decent possibility, if you're in bear country, that's what you're looking at is black bear scat. So for those of you who are interested in potentially seeing a black bear safely in the wild, a few areas I would recommend, all of them in the northwest part of the state. Old Mine Road is a fantastic way, and not just for black bears, but for any wildlife in New Jersey. It's a fantastic place to see it. It's almost like you can do it as a driving safari. There's certainly great places to stop off and hike, but if you're somebody who isn't comfortable doing any kind of major hike, but would still like the potential to see wildlife, Old Mine Road goes right along the Delaware River in the northwest stretch of the state, just from Route 80 north towards the border of Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. And gorgeous drive. and with a chance to see everything from black bears to porcupines to tremendous migratory bird habitats, and if you're real lucky, maybe even a bobcat sighting. But just a really gorgeous area. It also goes along that same ridge as Stokes State Forest, Delaware Water Gap, and the Kittatinny Ridge. That's all in that same general habitat. All of those are some of the best places to have likelihood of seeing black bears or other wild animals in the northwest part of the state. Waiweanda State Park is another great one. The reading I started this presentation with occurred at Waiweanda State Park, and I've seen bears there and several times, and it's also just a stunning place, one of the greatest natural areas in the state. And then the Appalachian Trail, which winds through a lot of what I described. Um, that whole stretch is generally a combination of just beautiful and abundant with wildlife. And so, if you're looking anywhere in that general region of the state, you have decent odds. Of course, with wildlife, nothing's ever guaranteed, but you have decent odds of either seeing a black bear, seeing some kind of sign of it, uh, and if you don't, you're seeing enough other wildlife in nature that you'll still go home happy. So for those in Cape May watching this, there's been 3 sightings that I have been aware of. I'm sure there are others that are not documented as well, but I know there was a couple sightings 8 years ago in Dennis Township and Stone Harbor. Maybe same bear, maybe not. And in 2015, at the end of 2015, most likely as the bears were getting ready for hibernation, there were a series of sightings along Indian Trail Road in Middle Township that were reported. None of these are like truly documented with photos, at least that I'm aware of, but there's no reason to doubt that the sightings were legitimate either. And like I said, there may have been other sightings since. It's most likely that any sightings that have been in Cape May have been individual bears on the move. So again, less likely that they would choose to make a home in any of those given spots. Although, who can say for sure? I'd always be interested in hearing anything further. If anyone has any sightings of their own, whether in Cape May or anywhere else in New Jersey, that they'd like to share, or just a cool story or anecdote, I would love to hear it. I'd be fascinated to hear anything about these incredible creatures. We'll end it with this wonderful shot that would make Teddy Bear proud. Just gorgeous creatures. And so I hope, if nothing else, I could take you a little bit beyond the controversy. Everyone has their opinions either way, and I respect that. And I'm not looking to change anyone's opinion right now with this. I just wanted people to get a close-up meeting with black bears here in New Jersey and learn a little bit more about their background and what cool species they are, and at the same time, hopefully reinforce that we always want to be safe and careful around any kind of wildlife. With that, just going to end it with a quick slide about how you can help wildlife here in New Jersey. There's everything from advocating for stronger environmental laws to which other groups, again, our group isn't an advocacy group, other groups are doing great work with that, to volunteering on different projects. It's a little tougher right now with COVID. However, Conserve Wildlife Foundation has volunteer projects throughout the year. Many other groups throughout the state have that as well. There's nothing better than getting firsthand experience, whether it's doing a planting or clearing invasive vegetation, or putting up an osprey platform, or other ways to volunteer. It's just great to have a hands-on experience in creating more wildlife habitat. And again, that's something you can do in your own yard, at your own school or church or community center. Whether it's planting native vegetation in things like butterfly gardens, to putting up bird feeders or bat boxes. All of that goes a long way, and wildlife certainly can use all the help it can get in a state as populated as ours here in New Jersey. And lastly, our group is a nonprofit, so anyone interested in supporting it with a contribution is also welcome. Our website is conservewildlifenj.org. I invite you to check it out. We have free wildlife webcams, and we also have a tremendous field guide with all of our at-risk species here in New Jersey, with tremendous amounts of detail on all these animals. You can also find my contact info there. My email is david.wheeler@conservewildlifenj.org, just like you see there. If there's anything you'd like to send me. Um, I do miss that we're not able to do a question and answer right now, but I hope that email is a second best option. If you did have anything you'd like to share, I'd love to hear it. So thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate Cape May County Library hosting this. And we're looking forward to our next presentation next month, and even more looking forward to when we can get back to doing these in person. But we'll be patient. Time will come when we're able to. So thank you, everybody.